Welcome to the Family Financial Conversation, an Advisorpedia-powered podcast about the decisions families make as they age that involve money, but might revolve around very different things. Listen in for thoughts from industry experts on getting the best possible outcomes from those decisions through the lens of great financial advice. We are all entering this age of longevity together. Let's begin.
Welcome, everybody. This is Tom West, your host of the Family Financial Conversation at advisorpedia.com. And it is my consistent pleasure to introduce again my co-host, Suzanne Schmitt. Suzanne, how are you doing right now?
I'm doing well, and I am excited to talk about what we're going to be delving into today.
I'm excited too. I think listeners that have clicked on to this particular topic, where we know we're going to be exploring aspects of elder financial abuse, or the idea of our clients and Americans in general being defrauded regularly. I think sometimes I would imagine listeners aren't quite sure what they're going to get on a podcast on this kind of a topic. So why don't we start, Suzanne, with your expertise of talking a little bit about the macro environment and maybe the difficulty of even defining what elder financial abuse is to begin with. Put some brackets around that for shared understanding.
Yeah, I'll do my best and say that it is a difficult topic to nail down because the lines can be blurred and they can also be very difficult to see. And by that, I mean, there are individuals who are going to be acting on another's behalf that may at times be mixing money, for example, and where the line is drawn between what is yours versus what is theirs can be challenging. Having said that, I'll go back to my upbringing and say, it is wrong whether somebody finds out about it or not. So said another way, if you are concerned about what somebody else's perception of your behavior would be relative to how you are treating that other individual or how you are expending their money, then it is fundamentally wrong. And I think that we need to err on this entire topic on the side of caution. So I would argue, Tom, that the definition of elder abuse or fraud is anything that is not in that individual's best interest and done with their full consent.
Sure. And so for listeners, remember that Family Financial Conversation is always going to land on places where differentiated service for advisors can most predictably lead to better retention and better organic growth. So if you go up, Suzanne, just like one level of altitude on an institutional level, you've had some direct experience in some big institutions with something called 4152 and some institutional approaches to these kinds of problems. Why don't you set the stage about the macro environment that our advisors have to sort of work in? And then we're going to drill down, I think, a little bit more into individual client and advisor experiences. But set the stage. What are the big boys thinking on this? What ground have they covered, and what do you think about it?
That's a great question. That's probably a whole podcast in and of itself. But what I would say is, you referenced 4152, and that is FINRA's trusted contact requirement. And in plain English, it means that institutions need to make a good faith effort to obtain trusted contact information on their accounts so that they've got somebody to contact if they feel that a client is acting in a way that suggests that they're having some cognitive difficulty or they might be having some impairment. So I would say, Tom, most of the institutions did respectfully the bare minimum that they needed to comply with that regulation. They assumed, I think in many cases, that proactive outreach would win the day, meaning that what they supplied their advisors with was really best case scenario, proactive outreach to fulfill the letter of the law. But respectfully, what I would say they missed is the fact that a lot of advisors and call center reps, because we know that they're on the front line, are getting people calling in for things like password resets or getting people calling in who are clearly, I'll say, cognitively challenged by their circumstances or depression or some underlying condition. And what I think our larger institutions really need to do significantly more on is, what do advisors or call center reps do in that circumstance? Because at that point, the horse may have very well left the barn, and taking that proactive only stance is not necessarily in anyone's best interest. And I think it really puts the advisor or the person on the phone in a very, very difficult predicament, not the least of which the family of that individual who may already be impaired.
Right. And Suzanne, there's 2 points in there. The first one, and I really like the foreshadowing, we absolutely are going to have a podcast on trusted contact, and then specifically opportunities that advisors can make out of that trusted contact process, like that's going to be one of the more interesting and proactive and prescriptive podcasts that we've already sort of built out. But I think the other piece too, when you're talking about trusted contact is the bare minimum. In my experience as an advisor, the bare minimum sometimes isn't even visible when my clients are going through all sorts of challenges with being defrauded or being taken advantage of. I would certainly echo, or to the point of shout, that as an advisor, when my clients are going through these different experiences, and we're going to talk about this, is almost a near certainty that our clients are going to be going through some element of being defrauded or taken advantage of or pressured or something along those lines. We'll talk a little bit more about the environment. But my experience as an advisor is I'm completely put to the sidelines. What the institutions have basically built for me is, Tom, you set off to the side. We'll put in some compliance functions that hopefully can claw back whatever monies might be transferring through the banking system. We're also, the institutions say, we're also going to very critically be looking at what kind of liability we might be having as an institution, Tom, because of your actions or inactions. Are you doing the appropriate things? But past that, Suzanne, I am completely on my own as an advisor, dealing with clients that are going through a number of different, very real challenges about strangers or about family members or friends sort of taking advantage of them. And the big message, listeners, that Suzanne and I want to sort of give you is, this is another opportunity, a true lived experience where families are going through some challenges that I want you to immediately think, listener, as a half full side of things. This is an opportunity, I believe, for advisors to proactively engage in a lived, shared experience that even if the outcomes result in something like maybe we didn't get all our money back, or maybe, the criminal got away with it in some degree, by not being a bystander and by jumping in and engaging shoulder to shoulder with your client as they're working through this sort of problem, that's an area where I think, the impact of relationship hugely drives, again, organic growth, the idea of better prescriptions around things like it's time to consolidate assets, and even most importantly, perhaps differentiating the experience for a second generation that might be coming up, like our last podcast, as successor decision makers. That's sort of where we're going to end up going. Suzanne, sort of back to you. Tell us a little bit about, any of your experience or advisors' experience that you've had. Let's get going with something a little bit more real and a little bit more sort of on the street. It's a good place to sort of jump off. Tell me a little bit about any brushes that you've had with elder financial abuse and fraud. I'll certainly share some of mine, and then we'll get into maybe what do we do with circumstances like that.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, I have more stories to choose from than I would care to, but I'm going to choose two that are standouts in my mind, and note that I'm going to change names because I don't want folks to feel the least bit embarrassed or that I'm speaking out of school. But the first story I want to tell is one that's really close, happened to somebody that is really close to me. And it involved a woman, I'm going to call her Rose. And Rose was a really devout woman, very religious, hard worker. And she had a couple of children, one of whom had some mental health challenges and was diagnosed much later in life as schizophrenic and did some self-medicating. So this individual was in and out of treatment and not necessarily compliant. I mentioned that Rose was devout, and she shared a lot with her faith community. She shared a lot online with Facebook and some neighbors groups. And unfortunately for Rose, an unscrupulous individual who was a pastor, or at least reported to be a pastor, contacted Rose and leveraged a lot of what he was able to learn about her and her daughter's situation online, and started to solicit Rose for funds that he was ostensibly going to use to build a religious-themed based care facility for individuals just like her daughter. And over the course of what was approximately a year, managed to steal, I'm going to use that word because I think it's accurate, from her, just over $100,000. And when Rose's family became aware of the situation and confronted her, very gently, I might add, in essence, that it kind of quickly devolved into a conversation, not so much about fraud or the shame that she was feeling, but about her faith, because she had heard from this individual that, if God didn't mean for him to have this money, then they wouldn't be having these conversations and she wouldn't have the money to give him. And, I'm going to put a pin in it there and say simply, I think this is both a story about mindfulness of what we share online. And I know we're going to come back to kind of do's and don'ts or best practices. But for this particular family, it also really, I think, not just rended the fabric of the family, but also of the faith of the family, because this family was very religious. And coming away from it, I think they had a lot of questions about how could this happen. So I'm going to put a pin in it and switch gears and share just one other story. And that is the story of John, who was a caregiver, worked very hard all his life, came out of an immigrant family, took care of his wife through her death, ultimately from cancer, and began to show signs of what we now would call mild cognitive impairment. And at that point, one of his children moved in, and that individual was going through a divorce, started to help around the house, started to help with medical care, also started to help manage the finances. You probably suspect where this is going. And unfortunately, in the process of managing those finances, managed them in ways that were not necessarily consistent with John's best interests, but with his own. And again, in the undoing, sort of the discovery and the undoing of that situation, family hadn't put in sufficient checks and balances. There were a lot of, as you can imagine, heated conversations. And those circumstances happened north of 15 years ago. And some individuals in the family still to this day don't talk. So I think that those two stories, while different, to me exemplify a lot of the dynamics and also offer up some cautionary tales for us as we think about ourselves, our clients, our loved ones. I'm going to, again, put a pin in that second story and give you a chance to break through.
Sure. Well, I mean, what I'm struck with both of those stories is sort of the center of gravity of how these people were victimized. It has a lot to do with identity. You've got a woman whose faith is so core to who she thinks about who she is and the role that she's playing. You've got another story with the role of caregiver trying to make sure that somebody's safe and, therapeutically taken care of and whatnot. The story that I've got, I think, is sort of going to the same place. I'll tell you a story about somebody that was taken advantage of because of their self-perceived role as a protector and as sort of a steward of making sure the family turns out right. But I want listeners, as I go through this story, I want you to listen for these things about identity and about agency, because when we think about, as advisors, the most effective way that we're able to bring our clients to accept calls to action that make impacts on their lives, what we're usually doing is we're talking about their identity and who they are and the roles that they want to play. So when we're dealing about elements of elder financial abuse and fraud and things like that, it's important to identify this is the area, the rich area, the fertile ground that we can make the most impact in our relationships, which can drive better financial outcomes. And listen to this particular story that I think is telling and has changed, I think, sort of my worldview on all things elder financial abuse. So about 5 years ago, I had a client, his name was Ed, he was taking care of his wife with mild cognitive impairment. And most listeners, Suzanne, you know about the fraud of the fake grandkid calling him up and he's in jail. So the fake grandkid called Ed up, I'm in jail, and got Ed to take some direction to organize a transfer from a Western Union that was at a 7-Eleven sort of down the street from him. And it ended up that the fraud never happened, mostly because Ed couldn't get his act together to be able to execute on the fraud down at the Western Union. But it occurred to him, as he was failing at transferring the money at the Western Union, to call his son to find out what he knew about his grandson being in jail. And that's when the fraud sort of fell apart. Kid's not in jail. Oh my gosh, Dad, you've been taken advantage of. We got to call Tom. We got to have a summit. We got to make sure everything's sort of protected. So we arranged the meeting. The son is on speakerphone. I'm at the dining room table. His cognitively impaired wife is in the other room. And I'm starting to coach Ed on all of the proactive things that I think that the industry kind of gives us. Like, just say no, hang up the phone, those sorts of pieces. And while I was sitting there, Suzanne, the son was on speakerphone, and then the fraudster called in. Fraudster calls in and clicks over, and I can tell by Ed's body language, this is the same guy that just defrauded me. So I will confess, in the moment of, I was not feeling insecure at all. I felt like I was right there to be supportive of Ed. And we've already coached Ed exactly what to do in this situation. So Ed's got his back up a little bit. He's about to tell the guy on the phone what's what. And I mildly tell him at the very beginning of the conversation, Ed, hang up the phone. What I wasn't expecting was how good the fraudster was on the other end of the phone. Like, I didn't have any experience with this. The guy on the other end of the phone pivoted and said that whoever's in the room with you, Ed, is exactly right to be worried about you being taken advantage of. But before you hang up the phone, let me make sure that we understand how I'm able to help, because that guy's right, but maybe I can call you back afterwards because there's a few things that he doesn't know. And what I saw in my client was like a confusion, like this pressure on him to simultaneously have an understanding that he's under threat, or in his case of his grandson, under threat, but that the fraudster has some path to be able to help him out. And I did even research afterwards that cognitive dissonance, that pressure that goes towards a lot of seniors that are taking advantage of, that's part of the magic formula that keeps working over and over again. And Suzanne, God is my witness, it was like Ed had a tractor beam on his attention. I'm 5 feet away from him, telling him to hang up the phone, and he can't hang up the phone. The guy is so good at keeping him engaged that I ended up, after the 4th time of telling him to hang up the phone, of shouting. Like, I might have cursed. I shouted. He dropped the phone, and the guy sort of hung up, or the guy sort of buzzed off. I'm sure he came around afterwards, but the echoes of that story, I think that shaped a few of my changing worldviews as an advisor. First one is, like, what a trauma for Ed. I think that reflecting back on it, his seen inability to protect himself, because he's got this advisor, because Ed doesn't have cognitive impairment, but he was definitely sort of some combination of ashamed, embarrassed, the rest of it, but he was still a proud guy that didn't want to have his family take agency away from him, like he doesn't know what he's doing, those sorts of things. So that was number one, because I was able to sort of witness, even though I was sitting there coaching him, I did all of the right stuff, everything that the institutions told me to do to be able to help my client, be aware and protect themselves. And I'm sitting in the room, and it didn't make a lick of difference. And I think that scared me into a worldview of, hey, everybody's going to get scammed. And the idea, you and I use the word of sort of cruel optimism, the cruel optimism that's getting pumped from a lot of the institutions, which is, if we can just make people more aware, they have a higher likelihood of protecting themselves. And, but the onus is on them to be able to solve this. And, I thought I was being like the advisor 2.0 guy by, all right, I'm just going to be there to sort of over deliver on this prescription. And it didn't make a lick of difference. And it shaped a lot of the way that I serve clients in general, where what I'm trying to do is I'm not trying to take away people that haven't been defrauded or knowingly been defrauded, because it happens all the time, like, that people just don't know. Like, Suzanne, if you're my client, I don't want to tell you, listen, you're a little suspect with your decision-making, Suzanne, so we're going to presume you're taking... I think that we got to talk about it as professionals, like, this is a state of nature that we're in. Because the truth is, I've been scammed personally. My parents have been scammed. I can't even tell you how many of my clients have been scammed. And as an advisor, I'm hugely frustrated where I'm sitting as a bystander, where I don't have the training or the resources to be able to give my client a differentiated experience in the face of what I think is just a climate of fraud and folks that are unscrupulous victimizing. And we haven't even gotten to the point of wire fraud or technology or any of those sorts of pieces. But I'm very frustrated as an advisor that I don't have the resources to be able to help folks like Ed out. That's sort of my piece. And coming back to your story, the thing that I'm remembering is if I was like, I had been successful as an advisor, appealing to Ed, being a protector and a caregiver of his wife, the rest of his family. He was proud of being sort of a retired Navy patriarch. And it was sort of a common theme of how financial decisions that I was able to guide him through was a good reflection on sort of who he was. But here in this space where his identity was sort of directly attacked, I didn't have the appropriate tools as an advisor on financial related stuff, which just absolutely murders me. So it makes for sort of a pivot on how I think we as advisors maybe need to be talking about all this stuff. And hopefully this direction, this sort of differentiated awareness, I'm hoping sounds different from a lot of the proactive PAP, which I think is necessary but not sufficient, which is what we're getting from institutions.
Absolutely. And if I could ask you a question about the story you shared of Ed, in that moment, where you've got to make a call about, do you really help to preserve his autonomy, his agency, or do you protect him? How did you make that judgment call in the moment? And would you do the same thing again?
Well, there's two ways that I would answer it. Like, I will tell you honestly, like, I was probably more in a panic. Like, I don't know that I had this rational decision. I was moving from a place of like, here I am a professional, like, and I know my way around seniors, and I'm a subject matter expert in all this stuff, and that's why I'm on the podcast. And like, I really felt like I was in control in my role at the table. And if it wasn't for seeing the impotence of all of that, not being able to reach Ed in the moment at all, I think I just sort of panicked and freaked out when I yelled at him. I yelled at him so loud, for example, that it got his wife in the other room all upset. So, like, I don't know that that was exactly what I would do again. I would probably maybe more gently give the same message, not necessarily reduce the sense of urgency, but I might have delivered it a little bit more gently. I think that the teachable moment is how I talk to other clients about it. Like, Ed's my story. Some of the stuff that like I've gone through, like my parents got sort of computer scammed and I got faked out with somebody that told me I forgot to do something and I gave a credit card number over the phone. But I think it's the Ed story that has changed the way that I talk to my clients about it. Because if you go down the path of, listen, there might be a situation where despite all of our best efforts and our proactive training, you might still get taken advantage of. And there kind of isn't anything to do about it. And if it can happen to Ed and it can happen to Tom, it can happen to you. And what I'm trying to do by changing the narrative, like, Suzanne, you're my client, instead of saying like, well, just, make sure you have all your stuff together and it probably won't happen, but it's still on you if it does happen. I don't want the eventuality, or sometimes, like in my mind, it's the certainty that my client gets taken advantage of in some way, that it's his fault, her fault, that it's my fault. It's not. It's sort of like the weather. You can't yell about the weather, but what you can do, and this is a big shift, what you can do is you can start imagining with the client, if you can set the tone with your client that like, look, this is probably going to happen in the same way that we're pretty good at saying like health stuff's going to happen, like fraud stuff's going to happen. And given that it's going to happen, let's figure out how are they going to get you? And if they get you that way, what are we going to do to minimize the damage after the fact? But what I'm doing is I'm engaging my clients, I'm engaging the family in problem solving, assuming that something that they get victimized, when I'm trying to take away the idea of shame and embarrassment by kind of normalizing it. And like, if it can happen to Ed and if it can happen to me, like it can happen to anybody. I'm trying to normalize it so I can engage the client in a way that is more proactive. And by the way, for advisors, other than doing right by your client and maybe reminding you of the stuff you should be doing yourself, this is the stuff that drives organic growth, meaning every single financial account that your client has is a bullseye. So when you're starting to imagine different things to, Suzanne, you're my client. Suzanne, once you get taken advantage of, where are they going to get you? Well, it's probably one of the 20 different accounts that you've got, right? Or your passwords aren't updated here, or you got way too many people with fingers in your sandbox. Maybe we reduce access, we improve line of sight among trusted folks. And I'm introducing those concepts where we're sharing in the customization and the tailoring of the solution particular to you, but I'm trying to invest again in who you are, what you want to do, how all of these money things are expressions of your identity, of expressions of your priority, of the way you care about other folks. Like I had this great conversation with one client, which is, given the most important thing is to make sure that your kids have a secure future with the legacy you leave, given that that's the priority, imagine that you're taken advantage of and defrauded. What do we need to do to keep your number one priority of take care of your kids? What do we need to do after you're defrauded? Like, and if you put a hypothetical together like that, like I'm engaging you very differently than being a total bystander when it's happened. Because like we've had a dry run at the crisis before it happens. And gosh, does the second generation pay attention to that?
Well, Tom, not only that, but I think, the notion of giving people a little bit of shock proofing by introducing the shock at a small quantity is incredibly helpful. I think reinforcing that this isn't just sort of an older person's issue, it's an every person's issue is also incredibly helpful, because you open the door when you make yourself vulnerable by sharing your own experiences for other people then to make themselves vulnerable. And that's a huge win, not just for the client or for the advisor, but also for the family. The notion too, Tom, I think of we've told older folks for so long that social isolation is bad and they should be tech savvy and they should be online and engaging. How do you deal with technology and the potential exposure? Certainly in one of the stories I shared, that was a huge issue. How do you touch on that with your clients in a way that isn't scary, but maybe put some guardrails around what they're going to put out there in the ether that can be consumed by the bad guys?
Yeah. I mean, my learned experience as an advisor is the best thing to do is scenario build after the fact. Imagine it just happened right now. What's the triage that we got to do? All right. Where did they get you? And what's the triage? And who do we need to call? And you do sort of a dry run along those lines. And I think that you're right. I mean, there's something about the empty virus cell, the idea of giving them a little bit before it does all the damage. And then the other thing that I want to add, I don't want them to be so defeatist that like, Suzanne, you have no ability to control when you're taken advantage of. That's not good. I always tell this one story where this client, Tina, she'd been taken advantage of, and we finally got her around after we normalized the experience, as long as you just don't get taken advantage of tomorrow. And I had one of the family member in the room who Tina was really worried about. When she was talking about it, her kids were going to be taking some control away from her. She did get it. I mean, she didn't have any cognitive impairment. She just got taken advantage of. It was like a big worry for her was, this is just a reflection of my kids thinking I don't know what I'm doing. And I got a compliment afterwards from an adult child, which is, thank you for normalizing the reality that she's definitely going to get attacked again in terms of for something or other. This lady is susceptible very much to sweetheart scams. But by normalizing it and de-shaming it, we were at least able to open up lines of communication that were more troublesome before. But secondly, the adult son was the one that chimed in, and we all got a laugh out of it when I was saying, like, listen, that doesn't mean that you need to get taken advantage of tomorrow. Like, tomorrow is the day. That's not going to happen tomorrow. And the adult son said something along the lines, sort of the quip, like, not today, Satan. I'm like, that's right. Not today, Satan. That's just stay vigilant, just to be ready. It's not going to be today. It might be sometime. We're going to talk about it. It's not your fault if it happens, but it's not going to happen today. And that posture, I think, is a lot more positive. It's a lot more engaging. It doesn't rip autonomy and agency away from folks. But I'll give you this last question, I think, to sort of raise it up one last level. Suzanne, like, how come as an advisor, I got to figure out all this stuff on my own? Yeah, because like nobody taught me any of this stuff. I recognize that I have a blend of skills and talents and background, but I still go back to the ed thing. I had no idea what to do there. Zero idea what to do. I haven't been trained on this stuff. I don't have somebody to call. There's no help desk to make my clients who've just been victimized feel better about it. I'm not even on the call. So I'm very frustrated with my industry where I'm simply a bystander for all of these things. And part of my motivation to bring this out on this podcast and in a forum like Advisorpedia is maybe a little bit of truth to power. We should not be having to figure this stuff out as advisors on the front line by ourselves.
Yeah, I am sorry that you have to say that out loud, but I'm really glad that you said that out loud. And I think the short answer, Tom, is, well, no advisor should have to figure this out on their own. The reality is that the major institutions are very concerned with liability, and they have put their efforts squarely in the camp of proactive intervention. I think there is some concern about how unwieldy these situations can be, and unfortunately, that concern has caused silence. And advisors are having to fill that silence, that space that's been left by the institutions on the front line. And I think that we may be at a bit of an inflection point as an industry in terms of advisors having to voice their real life experiences, just like you're doing right here on this podcast, to pressure in a constructive way those institutions to get much more, I'll say, gritty and hands-on in the kinds of training and the scenarios that they're actually running advisors through on product. You know, I think about that first story that you shared of Ed and actually being on the phone with him. How, I don't wish this on anyone for the record, but how powerful would training that was scenario-based be for advisors or for call center reps to put them through circumstances like that, help them feel some of the pressure that the client, the family, you as the advisor felt, and do some debrief on what are ways that we can actually help the client in those circumstances. I don't think that kind of training exists. And unfortunately, I think as long as we stay stuck in the liability space, we're not actually going to be doing that full fiduciary service to truly protect clients and act in their best interests. So long answer to a really, I think, important question. But what would you say in response to that? Clearly, you've had experiences that you maybe wish you had gotten some training on. What would you offer up? What's on your wish list for institutions?
Well, I mean, like, we've got a lot of institutional relationships, like me personally, your background, Advisorpedia, the rest of it. So like my response is not for my institutional listeners. My response is for my advisor listeners. Like, this sucks. When it happens to you, and it will, you need to raise this internally, just like I did, which is, how come I don't have resources to give my client a differentiated experience, which I know can drive better outcomes for my client, better relationships, better retention, consolidation of assets, differentiated G2 retention. Like, why am I figuring this out on my own? I think that a lot of times, institutions and advisors, a lot of times advisors feel the pressure coming from the home office about, like, think compliance, all the stuff that we're supposed to do and we're not. I think this is one of those ones where the shoe's on the other foot. I do not think the institutions are doing enough. I think advisors know that there should be helping out a little bit more. Advisors are trying to do their best when this happens, but just being side like this, like that's not what the market is expecting. And for the consumers that are listening, like, consumers definitely need to have more support from the industry top to bottom. So I guess my response is, I'd love just a tiny bit of a reinforcement for call to actions with advisors that when this stuff happens to you, and I shouldn't say it will, it is happening to you. It's already happened to you. It's happening right now. Of course, it's going to happen tomorrow. I think that, throwing it back up to the powers that be, that, like, we need to have better solutions in the hands of advisors to do a better job for our clients.
I would echo that as the non-advisor on this particular podcast, but also say I think consumers need better resources and should demand better resources from their institutions, not just consumers as in individual clients, but their families too. I did want to briefly mention there are a few resources in the consumer space that are worth mentioning, one of which is AARP's Fraud Watch Network helpline. That's a mouthful.
Oh, that's excellent. Yeah, absolutely.
But I did want to mention that for our advisors and for consumers that might be listening, you do not need to be a member to avail yourself of their services. They are up and running 8 to 8 Eastern time and have trained consumers who can help to engage. So the other thing I think that's really important about that is that network allows communities to know when somebody might be working a community or a particular scam. And lastly, I would mention No personal relationship to either of these firms, but EverSafe and Careful are two, I hesitate to call them identity theft protection services, but they are a combination bill pay, account management, family dashboard, communication enabling services that can be useful for adult children, for example. So extra eyes on older folks, older loved ones accounts, just as examples of resources that can be helpful in this space and hopefully also helpful to advisors.
Yeah, well, I will stay on my fist shaking at the sky bully pulpit. Like, how come that stuff isn't integrated in a lot of advisors' experience? How come I got to go find it on my own as an extra icon on my desktop? Like that, it's just too much of a pain in the neck to be able to bring these kinds of resources to my clients. So all of us need to do a better job, but it's not only on the advisors.
Couldn't agree with you more.
Well, thank you. Well, listen, with that, Angry Tom is going to start wrapping this up. Everybody, thanks again for joining us. This has been, I hope, an interesting conversation, maybe taking the topic in a little bit different of a direction. But we very much appreciate you guys listening. Make sure that you share this podcast with others. Thanks again to Doug and the team at Advisorpedia, and we look forward to talking with you guys next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Family Financial Conversation podcast. The information covered in the posted represents the views and opinions of the guests and do not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Signature Estate and Investment Advisors. Disclosure: Signature Estate and Investment Advisors, LLC, is an SEC-registered investment advisor. However, such registration does not imply a certain level of skill or training, and no inference to the contrary should be made. Securities offered through Signature Estate Securities, Inc., member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through SEIA, LLC, 2121 Avenue of the Stars, Suite 1600, Los Angeles, California, 90016. Telephone number 310-712-2323.